thought the night would swallow them, but then one man walked into darkness. A low wind whispered through the thorn bushes, carrying distant, haunting cries that no one could fully trace. The sun had yet to break the horizon when the first tremors of dread rippled through Dory's narrow alleyways, an echo of boots marching across dry earth somewhere beyond sight. At dawn on March 14, 2025, a pall of fear hung over the dusty streets of Dori, in Burkina Faso's Sahel region. Rumors had swirled for weeks. Boko Haram militants were massing just across the border in southeastern Niger, fueled by new recruits and unrelenting cruelty. The local military commander, Colonel Halidou Tayamoko, issued urgent dispatches: "We fear an incursion at any moment. Civilians, especially children, must be evacuated." Yet with winter rains, collapsed bridges and sandstorms choking the horizon, evacuation seemed impossible. Into this crucible stepped Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's young, unorthodox leader whose rise to power had been as sudden as it was unexpected. Barely a year into office after leading a bloodless coup that ousted a corrupt regime, Traoré had already charted a new course for his country, one of rights, dignity, and bold humanitarian action. Now, facing one of the gravest crises in recent memory, he vowed to prove that true leadership could defy geography, climate, and extremism itself. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's young, unorthodox leader whose rise to power had been as sudden as it was unexpected. Barely a year into office after leading a bloodless coup that ousted a corrupt regime, Traoré had already charted a new course for his country, one of rights, dignity, and bold humanitarian action. Now, facing one of the gravest crises in recent memory, he vowed to prove that true leadership could defy geography, climate, and extremism itself. The night sky above Ouagadougou was unusually silent on March 12, 2025. So silent it felt wrong. Colonel Halidou Tayamoko stared at his communications console, listening for whispers on encrypted channels. Then it came, a radio crackle in Hausa, frantic voices speaking of children carried off on dusty trucks. 42 young lives, torn from their families under the arch of desert stars. A sense of foreboding rippled through the presidential palace's situation room. General Fatoumata Sanan's knuckles whitened against the table. "They're crossing the Iru River at dawn," she said, voice steady but tense. On the projector, grainy satellite images showed black flags rippling atop pickup trucks, engines churning mud into the shallow current. Each truck carried at least a dozen militants. Intelligence officers estimated their numbers at 150, and growing. Traoré, seated at the head of the table, leaned forward, his face half illuminated by the screen's glow. Shadows flickered as if alive. A bead of sweat traced his temple. "These aren't just numbers," he murmured. "They are children." Below them, Ouagadougou's streets slept, oblivious. But beyond the city lights, villages near Diffa lay vulnerable, schoolhouses emptied, parents locked in anxious prayer. If Boko Haram established a foothold here, extinction would follow, culture erased, borders surrendered to fear. In the hushed intensity, a young intelligence analyst slid a sheaf of maps toward Traoré. Each map bore red circles marking suspected hideouts among thickets of acacia and termite mounds. In the corner, a small handwritten note read, "They arrive tomorrow." Traoré's gaze hardened. He tapped a finger on the largest circle, 3 compounds, 40 kilometers north of Dori. "We cannot wait for confirmation," he said. "We must move, and we must move now." General Sanan's voice broke the silence. "Sir, the usual channels say we need 6 weeks to mobilize regional forces." Traoré rose, boots echoing on marble. "Not this time," he replied, voice low but unyielding. "This is about children's lives. We'll carve our own path." His words hung like a vow in the air, an unspoken promise that would change the fate of dozens of families and test every ounce of his resolve. By moonrise on March 13, Operation Al-Salam was no longer theory. In Djibo's forward base, an abandoned warehouse amid ochre dunes, soldiers assembled under flickering lanterns. Their breaths formed white clouds in the cold desert air. Each soldier bore the marks of hardship, sand-etched boots, sun-bleached uniforms. Yet in their eyes burned fierce loyalty. Captain Traoré strode among them, barely recognizable behind night vision goggles and a chamois wrapped around his neck. He stopped at a sniper's side and pointed out a distant plateau. "Your shot must be the first sound they hear," he whispered. "Protect our advance." Nearby, Tuareg trackers checked compasses against the North Star. Pilots ran final system checks on two Mi-24 gunships, their rotors humming like restless beasts. Communications officers tapped keyboards, bridging Burkinabe frequencies with Nigerian police bands, an improvised lifeline across borders once thought unbreakable. Traoré gathered his lieutenants in a tight circle. The map was now smeared with red coffee stains and urgent annotations. "Three-pronged assault," he began, voice hushed. "East flank cuts through the wadis at dawn. West team moves under cover of tree line. Our unit will draw their gaze from the east, create the opening others need." Lieutenant Caboret frowned at the coordinates. "Sandstorms have collapsed that gorge twice this season. We risk becoming trapped." Traoré's eyes glinted. "Then we must learn to move like sand, flowing, shifting, unseen." A sudden gust rattled the metal roof. In that moment, every man felt the gravity of what lay ahead, a rescue mission balanced on a blade's edge, where one misstep meant not only failure, but the potential sacrifice of innocent lives. He placed a hand on Caboret's shoulder. "Courage is more than fear conquered, it's fear embraced. Tomorrow, we step into shadows for those who can't." Silence answered. Then one by one, his officers placed hands over their hearts in solemn pledge. At that moment, the night felt alive, charged with purpose, tinged with danger. And at the center stood Ibrahim Traoré, ready to lead them all into the darkness. By March 13th, the task force assembled at the Djibo Forward Operating Base, 8 hours' drive from Dori. Traoré arrived at dusk, clad in desert fatigues and a simple cap bearing Burkina Faso's tricolor. He greeted each soldier by name, sharing water from his own canteen. Meanwhile, communications officers hacked into Nigerian police channels, and a dozen volunteer pilots readied two Mi-24 attack helicopters modified to carry fast-roping teams. Local Tuareg trackers, nomads who knew every dune and dry riverbed, joined the effort, drawn by Traoré's promise of respect and fair pay. Traoré paced before a crude map painted on plywood. "Our intel suggests the children are held in 3 compounds near Lake Chad," he explained. The room fell silent as bullets rattled distant sandbags. Using hand signals, he outlined a daring pincer maneuver, one team advancing north along the riverbank, another cutting west through a nearly impassable Wadi's Gorge at night, and a third, Traoré's own, approaching from the east under cover of 2 helicopter gunships. The long night the convoy slipped into the unlit expanse like ghosts released into oblivion. The only sound was the soft clank of steel on steel as soldiers checked weapons under Traoré's watchful gaze. His heartbeat hammered in his ears, each pulse chanting, "They are out there." At exactly 2:17 a.m., a distant flare bloomed above Compound Alpha, painting ragged silhouettes against the sand. Traoré signaled a halt. Sweat beaded on his brow despite the desert chill. Footsteps behind him paused. 2 soldiers exchanging nervous glances. "Captain, we're in position," whispered Lieutenant Caboret, voice taut. Through the scope of his night vision goggles, he could just make out the crumbled walls where children had been held. Traoré nodded, exhaling slowly. Every breath tasted of dust and adrenaline. He checked his watch, 2:17, just as planned. With a crisp gesture, he sent his eastern flank surging forward. In the darkness, rifles cracked like thunder, and the night erupted into chaos. Flares arced overhead, jagged flowers of bright light that revealed the terror on faces behind wire fences. Children, awakened by gunshots, pressed small hands to mouths, stifling screams. Traoré vaulted over a berm, boots sinking into soft sand. Dark figures bolted from guard towers, the sharp bark of AK-47 fire sliced the air. Traoré advanced, helmet strap loose, sleeves rolled, an image of serene ferocity. He shouted into the racket, "Stay low. Move fast." Near a charred granary, he crouched behind a crumbling wall, training his rifle on two militants rifling through supplies. A bead of sweat slid into his eye. He squeezed the trigger. The muzzle flash illuminated a child's terrified face peering from a doorway. Heart pounding, Traoré sprinted across the sand, shielding the child as two comrades fanned out to cover their advance. "You're safe," he murmured, voice gentle amid the fury. Meanwhile, to the west, another squad fought through an orchard of gnarly date palms. Branches whipped at uniforms as enemy tracers stitched bright vines of fire through the darkness. A teenage tracker, Issa, tripped over a root, dislodging a clay water pot, its crash echoing like a death knell. For a heartbeat, the orchard fell silent. Then, like wolves sensing prey, militants converged. Issa's pulse pounded. He raised his rifle and held his ground, remembering Traoré's words, "Courage is fear embraced." Back at Alpha, rifle grenades blossomed against the mud walls. Traoré found a slit in the brickwork and peered inside, 9 children huddled together, eyes wide as the world they knew vanished. His chest tightened. He whispered, "Hold on," and fired a round above the door, shattering the lock. Wood splintered and a cheer erupted as the children tumbled into his arms. Their wet sobs and delirious laughter merged into one raw, beautiful sound. At that moment, surrender whistles pierced the air, enemy fighters dropping rifles, hands raised. Dozens emerged, shaking with relief or defeat. Traoré ordered them disarmed and detained. He glanced skyward, dawn's faint blush threatened the horizon. As the extraction helicopters roared in, the compound lay silent save for the ragged breaths of survivors and the low hum of engines. Traoré gathered the rescued children beneath the flapping wings, his presence a shield against fear itself. "We go together," he assured them, guiding each small hand toward salvation. Steel rang softly as Traoré pressed his palm to the cold mud bricks of the commandant's stronghold. His breath was steady but shallow, every instinct screamed for haste. He motioned to Sergeant Diallo, whose trembling hands fumbled a set of lockpicks. Under flares swinging like pendulums overhead, the door swung open with a reluctant creak that felt deafening in the tense silence. Inside, light from hastily rigged lamps cast long shadows over rows of makeshift cells. Traoré's sharp gaze caught the faint, frightened outline of 9 small forms huddled in the corner. Each child, wrapped in threadbare cloth, stared up at him with wide, glassy eyes, a raw mixture of hope and terror. He knelt and removed his helmet, letting the desert wind play with his hair. Leaning close, he whispered tenderly, "My name is Captain Ibrahim Traoré, and I promise you safe passage home." A tiny girl, no older than 7, reached for his dusty sleeve, and he gently scooped her into his arms, cradle-like, murmuring, "I won't let you go." Behind them, 2 guards stomped down the corridor. Diallo tugged at Traoré's sleeve, eyes pleading. Traoré nodded once, decisively, and they slipped behind a fallen wooden crate. In one fluid motion, Traoré unlocked his butterfly knife, extinguished the last glow from his lamp, and signaled. Trusting his lead, Diallo shot forward, swift, silent. The first guard crumpled without a sound. The second turned, eyes wide, but Traoré's blade pressed at his throat before a single breath escaped. As the 2 staggered back, hands held high, freedom rang out in the children's whispered sobs. Traoré slid the children out of the cell one by one, wrapping each in his chamois for warmth. Their small arms clung to him, like vines to a tree, desperate for life. Just then, a distant crackle, the jihadist commander's radio, still broadcasting twisted chants, stuttered into life. Traoré crushed it beneath his boot and ground the antenna into red dust, silencing the dark promise it carried. A flood of relief swept through the children as the last chant died on the desert wind. Extraction under fire, they raced across the courtyard, boots slapping against stone and sand. The waiting gunships throbbed overhead, stirring a vortex of dust that blurred the world into swirling golden haze. Boko Haram fighters, roused by the conflict within, poured out from behind low walls, guns spitting fire that whistled past Traoré's ear. "Run," he shouted, voice cutting through the roar. In his arms, the youngest child, tiny Adama, pressed her cheek against his chest, eyes squeezed shut. Traoré's heart lurched, but he did not falter. He angled toward the western gate, where Lieutenant Traoré and his squad formed a human shield, every barrel trained on the encroaching threat. A rocket slammed into a supply crate, sending shards of timber and metal into the air. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Traoré dropped to one knee, placing Adama gently on the sand. He covered her with his jacket, whispering, "They'll carry you out." Rising, he met the bullet hail head-on, his figure outlined against the blaze of helicopter searchlights. In a flash, the Mi-24's ramp slammed down, sending a heat wave across the courtyard. Soldiers jumped out, forming a corridor of protection. Children tumbled forward, each seized by waiting arms. Traoré stayed back, scanning for stragglers. Bullet impacts sparkled like deadly stars around him, but he stepped forward, commanding the enemy's fire until the last child was aboard. Then, hearing a distinct whimper, he spun and spotted an elder woman, arms outstretched, trapped beneath splintered beams. Without hesitation, he dove, wrenching the boards aside, and lifted her with both hands. She clung to him as they sprinted to the helicopter's maw. The crew chief hoisted her inside without a word. At that moment, a second explosion rocked the perimeter. Dust and debris cloaked the courtyard in a settling cloud. Traoré ducked under the rotor downwash and sprinted for safety, blood pounding in his ears. Moments later, the helicopters lifted off in unison, children crying out in relief, mothers clasping their young, and soldiers slapping backs in victorious joy. Traoré, helmet perched at a rakish angle, slid aboard the last gunship. As the dust storm receded beneath them, he peered down at the compound, once a bastion of terror, now eerily quiet, as though sleeping under the watch of a new dawn. And overhead, the pale light of morning promised a world forever changed. The aftermath, truth revealed. Morning light revealed more than physical wounds, it exposed the human cost of the night's desperate gamble. Nurses in white coats and Tuareg volunteers formed tender lines, handing children sips of sweet tequila porridge. Each gulp brought color back to pale cheeks. Traoré moved deliberately from cot to cot, helping steady trembling hands that clutched fragments of their shattered world. He knelt beside a small boy named Mohamed, who flinched at every distant echo of helicopter blades. Gently, Traoré removed the boy's bandage to check a bruise on his arm. Mohamed's eyes brimmed with gratitude and fear. Traoré met his gaze and whispered, "You are safe, little one. We're family now." The boy managed a shaky smile and gripped Traoré's finger as if it were a lifeline. In the makeshift press area, journalists jostled with cameras raised. Traoré faced reporters from Niamey to Nairobi. Their questions rattled him. Will there be reprisals? What about negotiations with other extremist cells? With calm authority, he replied, "We do not settle with terror through talks. We settle by defending our people and reclaiming hope." His words resonated across news wires, carrying not vengeance but a promise of justice tempered by mercy. Late in the afternoon, Nigerian officials arrived bearing files rescued from the compounds, ledgers detailing ransom payments, encrypted letters mapping future targets, and identification documents of local collaborators. Traoré convened a second council, this time with cross-border trust at its core. Handshakes and solemn nods sealed a pact. Burkina Faso and Niger would share intelligence, conduct joint patrols, and build radio relays powered by solar panels to keep communities connected and informed. As dusk fell, survivors gathered by a small well outside the base. Women sang ancient lullabies to calm young ones, their voices weaving a fragile tapestry of hope. Traoré lingered, listening, absorbing each note. When the chorus ended, he stepped forward and added his own verse, a verse promising safety, education, and the rebuilding of homes, with words that carried through the night like a new anthem. Under a canopy of billions of stars, the children slept at last, enveloped in blankets, their inhale-exhale rhythms a steady heartbeat of survival. Traoré stood sentinel, watching until the fireflies blinked out and the camp fell silent. He finally turned inward, retracing every choice, every risk, every whispered prayer that guided his team through the darkness. Within days, social media lit up with footage from the rescue, a sobbing mother clasping her child, Traoré cradling an orphaned girl, the roar of Me24's overhead. Hashtags like #PeaceInSahel and #TraRescue trended across Africa. International aid groups pledged over $200 million in humanitarian and reconstruction assistance, swiftly deploying medical teams, water purification units, and trauma counselors to Dori and Diffa. At the United Nations in New York on March 20, Burkina Faso's ambassador presented a detailed report on Operation Al-Salam. World leaders praised the mission's precision and compassion. The UN Secretary-General remarked, "Captain Traoré has shown that security and human rights can advance hand in hand." Behind closed doors, discussions began to replicate the task force model in other fragile regions. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré did not rest on laurels. He convened economic advisors to channel international funds into sustainable agriculture projects, ensuring villagers would no longer depend on aid and be vulnerable to extremist recruiters. He launched Project Jijia, Faith in More, a grassroots program training former combatants as community educators and conflict mediators. When asked about long-term goals, Traoré smiled wryly, "If next year you ask me again, I will be telling you not about one rescue, but an entire region free from fear." By late May, the first Jijia trainees returned to their home villages, not with rifles, but with laptops and chalkboards. In classrooms once empty, laughter returned. In marketplaces once silent, merchants called out prices. In every corner of the borderlands, the memory of that moonless rescue night transformed into the promise of dawn. On June 1, 2025, Dori's central square became the beating heart of a new Burkina Faso. The rising sun poured golden light over the sea of people gathered for the most significant celebration in the town's history. Survivors of the raid, soldiers from the operation, village elders, foreign envoys, and schoolchildren from every corner of the Sahel filled the space. Banners fluttered from rooftops, and cloth streamers, red and green and gold, shimmered in the wind. A stage of simple wooden planks had been built in the center, surrounded by handwoven mats and shaded by tamarind trees. 100 drums began to pulse slowly, like the beating heart of a resurrected nation. Dancers moved barefoot in wide circles, girls in white cotton and boys in crimson robes marked with symbols of fire and freedom. The children rescued from the Boko Haram compound, now healed, clothed, and nourished, led the procession with beaded staffs and wide, determined eyes. The crowd broke into cheers as Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped onto the platform, flanked by his closest advisors and local chiefs. He wore no uniform, no medals, no weapons, only a simple dark boubou with a single thread of gold along the sleeve. He walked slowly, eyes scanning the faces of his people. Some cheered, others wept, many simply placed hands over their hearts in silence. Traoré raised his hand and the drums paused. "This land," he began, his voice quiet yet strong, "has known sorrow, has known fire. But today, we write a new chapter. We were not saved by strength alone, but by spirit, unity, and faith in one another." Applause erupted, but Traoré continued before it could rise too loud. "I walked into the night that took our children. I saw the face of darkness, and I looked into the eyes of despair. And in those eyes, I saw one thing, a prayer. Not for revenge. Not for blood. But for peace, for a tomorrow where no child must be brave simply to live." A mother in the front row began to cry openly, clutching her daughter to her chest. One of the Tuareg trackers, face streaked with blue dye, bowed his head as if in prayer. Traoré turned toward the Nigerian delegation and offered a firm nod. "To our neighbors in Niger, we share a border, but more importantly, we share a destiny. Let this be the first of many moments we walk together. In the crowd stood Aminata, a teenage girl who had been among the first rescued. She clutched a drawing she'd made, a child standing before a burning hut, staring up at a tall figure extending a hand. She had titled it, "The Day We Were Found." Later, as celebrations rolled on into evening with singing, feasting, and poetry, a candlelit vigil was held for those lost before the rescue. Their names, over 50 from villages throughout the Sahel, were read aloud by surviving children. Each name was followed by the lighting of a lantern, which was released into the darkening sky until the stars above shimmered with echoes of memory. As night fell, Traoré retreated to his quarters on the outskirts of Dori. There, away from cameras and chants, he sat cross-legged by a low fire. A nurse entered quietly, reporting that all the rescued children had eaten well and fallen asleep with full bellies and clean sheets. Traoré nodded, looking into the fire. In his hand, he held a note. Just 4 words scribbled by one of the children, handed to him at the ceremony: "You came for us."